Hey Reddit, I need to get something off my chest, and I'm hoping for some advice. I'm using a throwaway account and changing the names and details to protect my privacy, but the emotions behind it are all real. I'm a 29-year-old software developer working at a startup in Austin, Texas. I've been doing well, especially after my recent promotion. On paper, everything looks great. I've got a good job, a decent apartment, and enough money to live comfortably. But despite all that, I've been feeling more and more isolated, especially when it comes to my family, or what's left of it. My mom died in a car accident when I was 15. It was a rough time for me, and just a year later, my dad remarried a woman named Hannah. Hannah and I never really clicked, to put it lightly. She always had this way of making me feel unwelcome, like I didn't belong in my own family anymore. Over the years, my dad and her started building a new life, and I was slowly pushed to the outskirts. It got even worse when my half-brother Alex was born. He's 14 now, and despite everything, he's probably the only person in that house I really care about. Hannah tries to keep him away from me, but Alex is stubborn, and we've managed to stay close regardless of her efforts. Growing up, I often felt like an outsider. My dad and Hannah made it clear, sometimes directly and sometimes subtly, that they were focused on their new family. I was always there when they needed something, trying to be the good son, but it felt like a one-sided effort. I can't count how many times I was disappointed by their lack of reciprocation. A few weeks ago, I was at work, just having a normal day. Code reviews, meetings, brainstorming sessions. I was deep into a project when my phone started buzzing. It was rare for my dad to call, especially in the middle of the day, so I picked up immediately, thinking something might be wrong. Instead, he was calling to ask if I could help them move into their new house. Apparently, they'd upgraded to a bigger place, something Hannah had been pushing for. Despite the years of feeling shut out, I found myself a little excited. I thought maybe this was a chance to reconnect with my dad, to show him that I still cared. I decided to take a couple of days off work to help them out. It wasn't an easy decision. I had some important projects going on, but I figured family comes first, right? I even went out and bought tools, ropes, gloves, anything I thought might help during the move. I told myself that this time would be different, that maybe we'd bond over the shared effort. When moving day came, I showed up early, hoping to impress my dad, or at the very least help out. But the moment I walked in, I was immediately hit with disappointment. My dad barely acknowledged me, just a nod in my direction, and Hannah was already barking orders at the professional movers they'd hired. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that the day was still young and things could get better. But deep down, I felt like an outsider again. The house we were moving out of wasn't anything fancy, a small 2-story place that held a lot of memories for me. As I lifted heavy furniture and packed up boxes, I caught snippets of conversation between Hannah and the movers. She was praising them for their professionalism, while completely ignoring the fact that I was working just as hard, if not harder. It felt like I was invisible, an extra hand to them, nothing more. At one point, Hannah accidentally knocked over a framed photo of me from when I was a kid. The glass shattered, and instead of apologizing or picking it up, she just shrugged and said, "Well, that was old anyway. We were going to throw it out." I froze, waiting for my dad to say something, anything to defend me. But he didn't. He just looked away, like it wasn't worth acknowledging. That moment hit me harder than I expected. It was like that photo, like me, didn't matter to them at all. As the day went on, I kept coming across more of my old things, stuffed into garbage bags, clearly marked for the trash. These were items I thought were stored away safely, things I thought meant something. I couldn't believe they were just going to throw them out without even asking me. I managed to save a few of them and quietly stashed them in the trunk of my car when no one was looking. By the time we got to their new house, it was clear that Hannah was in her element. The house was huge, modern, and in a pretty upscale neighborhood. She was busy giving a grand tour to some of their friends and family who had come over, and I tried to stay out of the way, feeling more like a stranger than ever. Hannah didn't even bother including me in the tour. She was too busy showing off the fancy kitchen and spacious living room. At one point, I overheard her telling my dad how relieved she was that they could start fresh. And then, I heard the words that shattered whatever hope I had left. My dad agreed with her, saying, "Yeah, it's good to leave the past behind." He wasn't just talking about the old house, he was talking about me. It took everything in me not to confront him right then and there, in front of their guests. I was torn between walking away or blowing up, but I kept my mouth shut. I didn't want to make a scene, but that feeling of being unwanted, of being considered a past mistake, stayed with me for the rest of the day. After the housewarming, I stayed quiet, trying to process everything. It was hard to swallow, the fact that my dad could so easily write me off like that. But I wasn't the kind of person who liked confrontation, so I kept it inside. A few hours after the guests left, I was still there, doing the last bit of cleaning and packing. My body was aching from all the heavy lifting, but my mind was racing even faster. Eventually, I couldn't hold it in anymore. The silence between us was unbearable, so I decided to confront my dad. I waited until Hannah was out of earshot and asked him straight out about what I had overheard. His reaction was classic dad. He tried to brush it off, saying I misunderstood and that it wasn't meant that way. But I wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily. I've been silent for too many years, so I pushed harder, telling him how I've always felt like an outsider and how they treated me like I wasn't really part of their family. And for the first time in a long time, I let all my bottled up feelings pour out. I told him how it hurt when they discarded my childhood belongings like trash, how Hannah always found a way to make me feel less than, and how he never once stood up for me. Hannah must have overheard because she walked in on our conversation just in time to catch me mid-rant. Her response was about as fake and patronizing as you'd expect. She put on this concerned face and said, "Oh, honey, you must have misunderstood. You're too sensitive. We never meant to make you feel that way. That's when I snapped. I wasn't having any of it." I told her I wasn't some child who didn't understand what was going on. I told her I knew exactly how she'd been treating me over the years, like a nuisance, like an afterthought, and how I was tired of pretending everything was fine. Hannah's mask dropped almost immediately. She went from fake concern to outright annoyed in seconds. She rolled her eyes, crossed her arms, and told me I needed to calm down and not make a scene in front of their new neighbors. That was the final straw. I couldn't believe it. There I was, spilling my heart out, and all she cared about was keeping up appearances. I looked over at my dad, hoping, praying that he'd finally say something in my defense. But he didn't. He just stood there, quiet as always, letting Hannah run the show like she always did. It was like he'd checked out, and I realized in that moment that I was never going to get the validation I was searching for from him. I wasn't going to get the father I needed, so I stormed out. I didn't want to make a scene, but at that point, I didn't care if I did. I grabbed my keys, walked straight out of their house, and slammed the door behind me. I barely held it together on the drive home. It was one of those moments where you're so angry and hurt that you can't even think straight. I was gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles were white, my mind racing with everything I wish I'd said, everything I should have done differently. When I finally got home, I just collapsed on the couch, overwhelmed by everything that had happened. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I called in sick the next few days, even though I wasn't really sick. I just couldn't face the world. I needed time to think, to process everything, and to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. A few days later, I got a text from my dad. It wasn't a heartfelt apology or even an acknowledgement of what had happened. It was a short, impersonal message that basically said, "Sorry things got heated, let's not have any bad blood between us." It was clear he was more concerned about smoothing things over for appearances than actually addressing what was going on. I didn't respond. I didn't know how to. What was there to say? I'd already poured my heart out, and it was like talking to a wall. A week went by, and I was scrolling through Facebook one night. I know Facebook's kind of old school now, but I still use it to keep in touch with old friends and family. That's when I saw it. Photos from their housewarming party. Hannah had posted them, and it looked like it had been a big event. All smiles, all their friends and extended family there, including people I hadn't seen in years. But what really got me, what truly stung, was the fact that Hannah had tagged everyone in the photos except me. I wasn't just missing from the pictures. I wasn't even acknowledged. Worse, in one of the comments, someone asked where I was, and Hannah responded that I was too busy with work to attend. Too busy with work? I couldn't believe it. I'd been there sweating and lifting boxes, helping them move, and they had the audacity to tell people that I was too busy to even show up to their party. It was like I didn't exist. like I wasn't part of the family at all. That was the moment everything clicked for me. They didn't just see me as an outsider. They wanted me to be an outsider. They were building their perfect little life without me in it, and I'd been fooling myself, thinking I still had a place there. The next day, I confronted my dad about it. I wasn't expecting much, but I needed to hear his excuse, just to see how he'd spin it this time. He tried to play it off, saying they didn't think I'd be interested in a boring housewarming party. Hannah, of course, chimed in with her usual nonsense, claiming she didn't want to bother me with family stuff because I was so busy with my career. I wasn't buying any of it. It was obvious they were trying to rewrite the story of our family, downplaying my existence to fit the narrative they wanted to present to their new neighbors and friends. I was some distant, unimportant figure, a past mistake, as my dad had so carelessly implied. They were moving on, and they didn't want me there. For the first time in a long time, I wanted to do something drastic. I wanted to hurt them the way they had hurt me. And then I remembered something. I had set up their entire smart home system when they first moved into the new house. The lights, the thermostat, the security cameras, even the smart locks, I had access to it all. The more I thought about it, the more appealing the idea became. I wasn't planning anything crazy, just small, petty things to mess with them, make their lives a little more difficult. After all, they deserved it, didn't they? So, I started messing with the system. Nothing major at first, just making the lights flicker randomly or turning the TV off when Hannah was watching her favorite shows. Then I messed with the thermostat, making the house switch between too hot and too cold in the middle of the night. Next, I set the security system to trigger false alarms, just enough to annoy them, but not enough to cause any real trouble. And you know what? It felt good. For once, I had the upper hand. At first, it was just funny to me, seeing how annoyed they got with the flickering lights or the thermostat suddenly cranking up to 85 degrees at night. I could imagine Hannah's frustration every time the TV turned off mid-show. I wasn't doing anything too extreme. Just little inconveniences that gave me a sense of control, like I was getting back at them in a way they couldn't even trace. I'd watch their reactions through the security cameras, my little private show. It gave me this strange satisfaction to see them dealing with those minor frustrations. Sometimes I'd watch Hannah pacing around, confused by the random glitches. Dad would just look helpless, probably thinking it was a tech issue beyond his understanding. I didn't feel bad about it, not yet anyway. They'd treated me like I didn't exist, and this was just my way of reminding them that I was still here, whether they liked it or not. But then something unexpected happened. Melissa, my half-sister, got caught in the middle of it. She's just 14, and she'd been staying at Dad and Hannah's place more often than usual. At first she thought the flickering lights and strange alarms were kind of funny, but as it kept happening, she started to get scared. One night I was watching through the cameras, and I saw her sitting in the living room looking nervous. She refused to sleep in her room because she was convinced something was wrong with the house. That hit me harder than I expected. I didn't mean to scare Melissa. She had nothing to do with any of this, and it felt wrong dragging her into the mess. But I didn't stop. Not yet, anyway. I figured it was still mostly on Dad and Hannah, and they were the ones who deserved this. So I kept going. It didn't take long before things started to spiral. Hannah was convinced the house was haunted. She even went so far as to call in some psychic to cleanse the place. I kid you not, I watched through the security cameras as this woman walked around with burning sage, chanting and waving her arms like she was driving out evil spirits. It was ridiculous, and I had to suppress my laughter as I watched. Dad didn't seem to believe in the whole haunting idea, but he didn't stop her either, probably just going along with it to keep Hannah happy. But then something else happened that I hadn't planned for. My tech-savvy nephew, Jason, got involved. He was visiting Dad and Hannah one weekend, and apparently he noticed something off with the smart home system. It didn't take him long to figure out that someone had been tampering with it. He's sharp, and honestly, I wasn't trying too hard to cover my tracks, so it didn't take him long to trace it back to me. I thought that was the end of it. I figured Jason would tell Dad, and I'd get an angry phone call or maybe a stern message. But nothing came. Instead, a few days later, there was a knock at my apartment door. I wasn't expecting anyone, So when I opened the door and saw my dad standing there, I was genuinely surprised. He didn't look angry though. He looked desperate. Can I come in? He asked. And for a second, I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to slam the door in his face, but another part, the part that still, deep down, wanted some kind of connection with him, nodded and let him in. We sat down in the living room, and I could tell right away that this wasn't going to be a normal conversation. He didn't bother with small talk. He just asked me straight out, "Did you have something to do with the stuff happening at the house?" I wasn't going to lie. Not this time. I told him everything. How I had access to the system. How I had messed with the lights and thermostat and why I did it. I could see the shock on his face as I explained it all. He wasn't angry though. Not in the way I expected. Instead, he just sat there, stunned, like he couldn't believe what I was saying. "What's wrong with you?" He finally asked, and that's when the shouting started. He accused me of being childish and of taking things too far. He said I was being petty and immature and that I should have come to him if I had a problem, not sabotage their house. But I wasn't backing down. I told him everything, how they'd treated me like an outsider for years, how Hannah had made it clear I wasn't part of their new life, and how he had let her. I told him how hurt I was when I overheard him say it was good to leave past mistakes behind, and how he'd let them throw away my old belongings like they were trash. It felt like I was letting out years of pent-up frustration, things I should have said a long time ago but never had the courage to. The argument escalated quickly, with both of us yelling so loudly that my neighbors probably heard every word. I didn't care. I was done holding it all in. By the time the shouting stopped, my dad looked broken. I'd never seen him like that before. He didn't say anything. He just stood up, gave me this long, defeated look, and walked out of my apartment without another word. I sat there for a long time after he left, trying to process everything that had just happened. I thought that might be the end of it, that maybe after all the yelling and anger, we'd finally said everything that needed to be said, and we'd go our separate ways. But I should have known better. Hannah wasn't going to let it go that easily. A few days later, she showed up at my office. I was sitting at my desk working on some code when my boss came over and said, "There's someone here to see you. I think it's your stepmom." The look on his face said it all. He wasn't happy about it, and neither was I. I had no idea what she wanted, but I wasn't about to have a scene at work. So I walked out to the lobby, and there she was, sitting in one of the chairs, looking completely out of place. I braced myself for a confrontation, but when I sat down across from her, she didn't yell or cause a scene like I expected. Instead, she kept her voice low and calm, which somehow made it even worse. "I know what you've been doing," she said, her voice steady, "and I want it to stop." I didn't say anything at first. I just stared at her, waiting for the inevitable explosion, but it never came. She just sat there, explaining how they'd figured out it was me messing with the smart home system, how she knew I was hurt, but that this wasn't the way to handle things. I didn't care what she had to say. I wasn't about to sit there and listen to her pretend to care. I told her as much, and for once, she didn't try to argue. She just stood up, smoothed her skirt, and said, "You need to grow up." Then she walked out, leaving me sitting there, feeling even more lost than before. It wasn't long before the rest of the family found out. Dad must have told them because suddenly, my phone was blowing up with texts and calls from relatives, some of them angry, some of them supportive. Social media turned into a nightmare, with passive-aggressive posts from cousins and aunts taking sides. The whole family drama was out there for everyone to see, and I was caught in the middle. Melissa was the only one who didn't say anything. But a few days later, she sent me a message telling me she missed me and that she didn't believe what her mom was saying about me. That message hit me harder than anything else. I didn't want to drag Melissa into this mess, but knowing she still cared about me was the one bright spot in all of it. After that message from Melissa, I knew things had gone too far. I didn't want to mess with her life any more than I already had. She was innocent in all of this. So I stopped. I cut off my access to the smart home system, deleted everything, and tried to move on. But as much as I tried to convince myself that I'd won some petty victory over Hannah and my dad, I knew I hadn't really solved anything. Things with the rest of the family got worse before they got better. The arguments and passive-aggressive posts kept coming. Some of my aunts and cousins reached out, trying to play mediator, saying I should let it go and just be the bigger person. Others outright accused me of being vindictive and immature. But there were a few, just a few, who actually listened to my side of the story. They understood why I was hurt, and that was enough for me to know I wasn't completely alone. Still, the weight of everything was starting to crush me. I'd spent years feeling like I didn't belong, like I was always fighting for a place in my own family, and now it felt like that place was slipping even further away. It was exhausting. Around this time, I started seeing those ads for DNA testing kits. You know the ones. You spit in a tube, mail it off, and a few weeks later, they tell you where your ancestors came from. I don't know if it was some weird coincidence or if the internet just knew I was going through a family crisis, but the idea of finding out more about my roots started to intrigue me. So on a whim, I ordered a kit. I figured, what the hell? Maybe it'd be interesting to see where my ancestors came from, or at least give me something else to think about besides all the family drama. When the results came back, I wasn't prepared for what I found. I opened the email expecting a breakdown of my heritage. Maybe some European, some Native American, something cool to share with friends. But instead, there was a bombshell. My dad wasn't my biological father. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. I double-checked everything and went over the data multiple times, but the results were clear. I couldn't believe it. It was like the ground had been pulled out from under me. Suddenly, everything about my childhood, everything I thought I knew, was thrown into question. The way my dad had always been distant, the way Hannah had pushed me out, maybe it wasn't just about her. Maybe my dad had known all along. I needed answers. I couldn't let this go, not now. So I showed up unannounced at my dad and Hannah's house, DNA test results in hand. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I needed to know the truth. When I confronted him with the results, his face went pale. For a moment I thought he might deny it, but then he sat down and told me everything. My mom had had a brief affair with one of my dad's closest friends, and that's where I came from. My dad had known for years but never said anything. He'd kept it hidden, trying to raise me as his own, even though I wasn't biologically his. It was clear from the look on his face that this wasn't an easy thing for him to admit, but that didn't make it hurt any less. What made it worse was Hannah's reaction. She overheard the conversation, and instead of being shocked or sympathetic, she smiled. I'll never forget that smug smile on her face, like she was finally pleased to have something to hold over me. It made me feel sick. She had always treated me like I didn't belong, and now she had proof that I really didn't. I realized in that moment that I had been chasing something that was never real. I had spent my whole life trying to be part of a family that wasn't really mine. And now with this revelation, everything makes sense. The way my dad had always been distant, the way Hannah had treated me, it all clicked into place. I wasn't really their son. I never had been. That was the breaking point for me. I decided right then and there that I was done trying to force something that was never going to happen. I told my dad that I was cutting ties with both him and Hannah. There was no point in trying to fix something that had been broken from the start. He didn't fight it. He just sat there looking defeated, while Hannah stood off to the side, still smiling that horrible smile. The hardest part of all of this was deciding what to do about Melissa. She was innocent in all of this, and I didn't want to lose her. We'd been close for years, and I wasn't about to let my issues with Dad and Hannah ruin that. So I promised her that we'd stay in touch, no matter what. We've been secretly messaging since then, and she's the only connection I still have to that part of my life. As for the rest of the family, reactions were mixed. Some people were supportive, saying they understood why I did what I did. Others were furious, accusing me of abandoning my family. But at this point, I've stopped caring what they think. This isn't about them. It's about me finally finding some peace after years of feeling lost. It's been a few weeks since that confrontation, and while I can't say everything's magically better, I do feel like a weight has been lifted. I'm no longer chasing after a family that doesn't want me. I'm not wasting my energy on people who see me as a mistake. I'm focusing on myself, on my own happiness, and on the relationships that actually matter to me, like the one I have with Melissa. I've thought about looking for my biological father, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that yet. He obviously never looked for me, so maybe it's better to let that part of my life go. Maybe one day I'll be curious enough to reach out, but for now, I'm just trying to heal. So that's where things stand. It's been a wild, emotional ride, but I feel like I'm finally starting to move forward. I'm not sure what the future holds, but for the first time in a long time, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that I can find some peace and build a life on my own terms without the baggage of a family that never really wanted me in the first place. Thanks for reading, Reddit. If you've made it this far, I really appreciate it. And to those of you who gave me advice, even the tough love, thank you. It helped me more than you know. I'm going to focus on myself and the relationships that really matter from here on out. And hey, if you ever need help setting up a smart home system, maybe don't call me. I think I've had enough of that for one lifetime.